Hello, welcome to another week of Cabbie Conversations. I'm James and I'm joined with Ed as always.
Hello.
And today we're just going to dive right in and talk about kinks. Um, I had a conversation with a friend about kinks, and I thought, you know what, we should make a podcast on this because um, kinks, if you, people, sex is obviously a very private part of people's lives. It's increasingly becoming less and less private. People feel more open about their lives, but kink is still something that is very much stigmatized, and it can be something that people may be curious to explore by themselves or with other people, but don't necessarily do so. And I think it would be interesting to basically look at the origins of kink shaming, and who basically pursues kink, as well as some very interesting kinks which I've learnt about this week.
Yeah,
Um,
indeed.
so Ed, I guess should we start off by defining what a kink is as opposed to what a fetish is?
Yes, there is a slight difference. Essentially, a fetish is, from what I can tell, a fetish is sort of purely sexual. There's also, uh, to a certain extent, I think there's more of a visual aspect of it. I don't know how to describe it. Like the way I heard it described was there was almost more of a shallow, not a shallow, like a shallow aspect of it. Like it was mostly visual or whatever. A kink is tends to be it's not necessarily sexual, as we'll probably get onto later, and B, it seems to be a lot more based on like role play and uh, putting yourselves in situations and like sort of imagining things. So there's a slight difference there. I don't know. Would you agree
Fantasy.
with that?
So kink would be more fantasy, and a fetish is a sexual desire towards a body part or an object,
Yeah. Yeah.
maybe more so.
Yeah, that's a good
Um,
way of putting it.
but, First off, I'm going to ask you is, do you think that kink could be a sexual orientation?
Now, this is very interesting, you see. I don't think so. I think primarily when we talk about sexual orientation, we talk about what gender uh, or lack thereof, or there's obviously more avenues to it. But I think what it generally means is that you is who you are attracted to. You know,
Yeah,
a kink and stuff is more what you're attracted to in a
or
person.
what you like to do.
Yeah, what you like to do. Because there's plenty of people who are straight. They only have sex with the opposite gender, and they are also into all sorts of stuff. So I don't. Obviously, it's a bit of a arbitrary distinction, you could say, but I do think that there's a slight difference there. Would you agree?
Definitely. I mean, the argument for kink being a sexual orientation is it's because it's quite a strong, often and persistent desire to do certain acts or to engage in a fantasy.
Mm.
Um, it's often beyond your conscious control, and often starts very, like, the onset of the desire to enact a kink often starts very early on. So like your first encounter or your first fantasy or perception of a fantasy will often occur under the age of 10.
Mm.
So you will what you so um you might watch a TV show, say, with like superheroes, but you might really identify with like being captured. Or if you say, like, if you have more of a, say, fetish for like Power Rangers, you might find like the suits really, really hot and want to engage with play with like sort of masks or tight latex suits or something like that. And
Mm.
that might really turn you, that you might as a child think that's really, really cool. But it's not until like a bit maybe slightly older when you self explore that, either erotically or not, as a child. And then you might progress to like evaluate it, because you then realize that other people may not have the same ideation of maybe wearing like a Batman costume, or I don't know, engaging in age play. So maybe, wearing nappies or something. It might not be
Yeah.
so, you realize that that's actually quite a strange behavior.
And that I think further drives the point of that it's less about sexual orientation though, because it's like, say the Power Rangers thing, right? It's like you're really into dressing up and having these tight suits on, but obviously if you're gay, then you like the your own sex to be doing that stuff, and if you're straight, then you want a woman or the opposite sex to be doing it. So that I think that's like,
Definitely.
to me, that's like that's the distinction there.
Yeah, I mean, yes, sexuality is all about who you go to bed with, and then
Mhm.
kink is the kind of play that you decide to engage with that person. So it's
Yeah.
not quite, it's separate but different, but
Mhm.
it still definitely makes a key facet of people's sexual sex life, um
Yeah.
which is I think quite quite fun, if you
Should
want
we
to.
uh
Mm.
just because for the people who are uninitiated, I suppose, we give
Yes,
some examples of some especially out there strange kinks and
yes,
fetishes?
let's do that. So let this something that I've just come across is, this is actually a fetish, or it's called sidromophilia, which is a fetish for trains and engaging in sexual activity on a train. So if you ever want to have a go, you know, um, if you're into public sex, or like sex in public, have you done it on a train yet? Everyone knows about the Mile High Club, but no one knows about the train, about, I don't know, the East Coast Club.
Yeah, I think obviously you and I were slightly different in the sense that I think I grew up on the internet. At least maybe that I guess you could call it the quote unquote slightly weird side of the internet. Not that I was
Yeah,
like necessarily engaged in these fetishes myself, but like if anyone knows like sites like Newgrounds and stuff, you basically any sort of site that had lots of people contributing their thoughts or their art or something like that. I don't know. I feel I was probably exposed to this stuff a lot earlier than most people. So my sort of um, capacity to believe what is and what isn't a fetish is probably quite low at this point, because there basically is a fetish for pretty much anything. Uh,
mm.
an example is formicophilia, which is an interest in being crawled upon or nibbled by insects. There's fetishes for being eaten. There's
Yeah, that's
fetishes
four.
for, yeah, vor, being stepped on, all sorts of stuff that you might not be aware of. Pretty much any scenario you can think of.
But
Could be
it's
someone's
also
fetish.
important to highlight that it doesn't have fetish doesn't have to be this extreme. It doesn't
No.
have to engage in fetish. It doesn't have to be liking what some people might find as quite foreign forms of play. People often don't jump in at the deep end and with the full fursuit. A fursuit, first of all, is very expensive, but often people like might it takes a while to kind of warm up and to become comfortable with these things. I think, everyone take and to kind of almost accept this form of play in yourself. I think it's another version of coming out,
Yeah.
if you like. You have to
They
discover
often
that
go on.
you like this play, but then also there are other people that like this play, and finding
Mm.
a space where you feel safe to do that
They often,
takes.
furries specifically, they often start with drawing what they call personas. So
Oh yeah,
it's not really a coincidence that I think that a lot of artists, or I'm not sure which way around it goes. I would say I would say like a lot of furries are artists because they probably start drawing themselves as their first,
mm.
and then they eventually move on perhaps to dressing up and stuff. I think what you said about the community thing is really important as well, particularly with like um, furries and kinks, I guess you could say specifically, because that I'm sure that helps people a lot to realize that they're not the only people who feel that way. Probably I imagine it's very reassuring to be in a room with all these people that get it on a very fundamental level, because we can sit here and talk about it, but really we're not going to understand what it's like on a fundamental level.
There are dating apps for, or dating spaces for it, and there are definitely, I mean, I heard that I think York has a kink society, York University has a kink society for a start. So you can meet like-minded people if you wish to pursue a certain kind of sexual endeavor. If you go on certain dating, I think it's FetLife is the biggest fetish dating app or exploratory app. And then also if you go on an app like Grindr, it also allows for fetish. So there's subgroups within Grindr. There's leather and there's daddy for a start. So if you're into age play or sort of strong submissive dominant dynamics, those sites also cater for an aspect of variation in play, because leather is quite a strong, it's quite a was created out of the LGBT group. It originates from there. But
yeah, I was trying to look about that because I kept reading that over and over, but I didn't really see what the source of it was, like in terms of where do you think that came from? The whole leather thing. Maybe motorcyclists. That's like an extension of that. It's quite a masculine image.
I mean, yeah, bikers originally were very hard as nails, and it's quite interesting actually looking at masochism and sadism play within like sexuality in men. So men throughout in kink show an equal desire, no matter their sexual orientation, to kinky play. Gay men actually tend to prefer to be more masochistic, more dominant. So that would explain like the often desire to pursue maybe leather to be hyper masculine, whereas heterosexual men tend to be more into shaming and exposing vulnerability within play, which is quite interesting because homosexual men typically are the oppressed group, and heterosexual men are I guess the ruling group. I don't know, the dominant group. So it's interesting how, and this repeats throughout kink, that often oppressed groups use, or oppressed groups or people or suppressed groups use kink to basically explore sides of themselves which are not necessarily allowed within society. So something I found very interesting in a study about kink was that people who engage in kink or BDSM tend to have lower levels of PTSD, depression, anxiety, psychological sadism and masochism, and are more conscientious and open to experience and less sensitive to rejection. So in comparison to controls who do not pursue BDSM, for example. Also, it's noticeable that trans and non-binary people tend to have a preference for rougher sex, and autistic people also quite like kinky sex or BDSM, because within those groups, consent is very important. You have to discuss within BDSM, you have to discuss your boundaries first, safe words. It's not necessarily particularly verbal. And so that could really suit somebody autistic because they don't have to speak too much, but they can enjoy the physicality and the experience. And also going back to the idea of dealing with trauma, trans and non-binary people do suffer as a whole more trauma on a societal level than the general population. And so this allows this kind of allows people or rape victims to kind of discuss, to kind of empower themselves and kind of engage in maybe trauma that has happened, but in a safe space and playful way that makes them kind of take ownership of the trauma that happened to them, which I thought was really interesting.
You almost take control of it if you do it in a setting where you know that you can stop anytime and it's not real. You know, I think there's something to be said. I mean, it would be good to get you to say, I can really find a consensus on this. There are those that believe that, for example, if you're really into the whole masochism thing, that on some level you feel you have low self-esteem, or that you've been through some sort of trauma, like you say, that sort of shapes the way that you view yourself, and then you view sex, and then that, therefore it excites you, or it's the only way, not the only way, maybe phrase. That's what gets you off ultimately, because that's all you know, is that
Mm,
you that's what you think sex is. And there are others, of course, that say no, that's not really true, because again, it's like you're taking control of the situation. You're willing to submit. So that's like, a power move of its own. And there's nothing
mm,
really to suggest that uh, people who prefer to be dominated, for example, have low self-esteem, or the reverse, that people who like to dominate are somehow, you know, bullies, and people like they like to abuse people. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
um I think it's say if you are like to be submissive and be humiliated and stuff, it's a reclam, and say you have been abused or bullied in the past and called a sissy or whatever. It's a sort of it's like reclaiming that for yourself and empowering yourself. Yes, I am that, but
Yeah,
I enjoy that, and I'm having a good time within this role. So,
yeah,
and it kind of helps you, it helps you kind of accept it and move past it and say, well, yes, but maybe I enjoy that. And
yeah,
if you kind of and that can help you improve your confidence, and maybe not make, maybe outside of the area of kink and sex, maybe actually make you less of one, because you've almost respected that boundary, or you've reclaimed that to the point where maybe with outside of sex that no longer feels like part of you, because you've moved past it.
that's fair. Very fair. I also think that there's some level of correlation, but not necessarily causation. So, for example, I'm sure that there are plenty of people who, and this, I think this was generally the consensus, like the more modern consensus, was that uh, there are plenty of people who are completely comfortable in their own skin, that
Mm,
are fully confident, whatever. But when it comes to bedtime, they like to be tossed around. They like to let someone else take control, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you've been through some sort of trauma, or that you think less of yourself or something else. But say you're the kind of person that doesn't is perhaps doesn't really think of people as people. They kind of you're kind of a user. You use people. There is probably some correlation there in the way you treat the other sex. But of course, the key difference is that with a kink, or like specifically a kink, like if you're playing the role of the dominator, there is a very different uh, sort of mental process that goes into that. Whereas a lot of times, people will just take charge without
mm.
asking. I think that's the differential there. That's in the two. That's what divides the two camps.
Yes, definitely. That's the difference between kink, because kink is just consensual and discussed, whereas non-kink, or say assault, is not. So there is a kind of play called abduction and seduction, or consent, and another group is consensual non-consent. So basically
Yeah,
consenting to a pretend rape scenario or whatever.
yeah,
It is important that the person actually, there was a book I read which actually had a scene on this. It was called Ian Banks' Complicity. There's a scene in the book and one of this, and I was kind of taken aback at first, but I was actually, that's actually quite cool. I didn't know that was like
mm,
a form of play and stuff. I mean, I read the book when I was 16, so it was a bit of a mind blowing, like, what's that?
yeah.
um, but it's important here because they discuss. I mean, maybe say they might discuss whether the person who is going to be the pretend victim in this scenario, um, they actually they will discuss maybe what, like, they might say, they might discuss how the person gets in, to say if it's like they have to break into the house, how the person gets into the house. So maybe like property isn't damaged, or so they're not startled, or I don't, or in a way that's not too alarming, or they might discuss like ways that the person is not allowed to approach, things like that. They might give them a ballpark of like, this week you can do this, but maybe, you know, another, so they don't just rock up out of the blue. Like, so they might not know
Yeah.
exactly when in that week it's going to happen, but they know it's going to happen. So, or like that they're aware, and that could be seen as quite thrilling and quite exhilarating.
Yeah. I might even they often might even create characters almost like LARPing or something, like yeah, particularly in sort of scenario, in the more elaborate scenarios, the kind of thing you're talking about. Oftentimes they won't play themselves as sort of a way to further differentiate that. And I think that's the thing that people struggle to get their heads around. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean that they actually want to get raped. In fact, I don't think it does in any way. Like, obviously, because nobody wants that. But it's like we humans have very complicated brains and sex drives, and I do think that the fantasy element of it creates that barrier that we are comfortable with. That's very, very different. I mean, it's the same reason, kind of, I would say, to sort of relate it to a sort of normal person's understanding of it. It's the same reason why you can go to the cinema and watch Indiana Jones and have a thrilling time seeing this guy, you know, shoot people, nearly die, have this exhilarating time, because you know in the back of your mind it's not real. You know, there's sort of the fantasy element to it. You would not, the people who enjoy those films would not actually like to get in a car and get chased and shot at. You know, most people would freak out in that situation. And that's the way to sort of understand it, at least the way I understand it.
It's a form of escapism and a form of imaginary play or fantasy that you get to explore, because I think, I mean, at least how I kind of perceive, I mean, I think somebody explained to me as sex as an adult is adult playing. It's a sort of like it's a sort of, it's something you do because as adults, much of our day we have to be mature and serious and, you know, engage in actions that have been major consequences in both our lives and other people's lives, and we have to maintain a level of security and stability. But sex and kink is all about kind of creating a safe place where like risks can be taken and it can be exciting and exhilarating and not the end of the world if something different happens.
It's pure hedonism.
I mean, it is. Basically. It is pure hedonism, but you know, everyone needs to have a bit of fun.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned the escapism thing. I think that's a lot to do with definitely like the furries, that kind of thing, because that's more of a lifestyle rather than just, you know, what you do in the bedroom. I think that's a large part of that, because I don't want to generalize, but a lot of the stories I've read from actual furries is the kind of thing that's like, well, you know, I work at kind of a shit job, or, you know, I'm not very happy at home, basically. So going out and dressing up and stuff is the only way to sort of make myself happy, or just a way of, you know, maybe not, it's not even that bleak. It's more just like a way of relieving stress, you know, and that's sort of what gets you through the week.
I think adult play is very much the adult babies is very much the same. It's an explore, because we kind of perceive childhood as a lack of responsibility and basically getting to indulge maybe in some bad behaviors that we would not get away with as an adult. And so adult play allows you to escape the expectations of the adult world and or adult babies, and kind of regress in a sort and be a bit more eccentric or silly, which we're not, or childish, which so much of the time we're not allowed to be. There's another sort of play where people are very much into the idea of having a, what's it called, transformation. It's transforming into
Oh
maybe
yeah.
an alien or something else, and kind of engaging in a more fantastical form of play. Maybe you become a Jedi, or I don't know, something else.
Yeah.
And that is again another major form of escapism.
Transforming into a
Which,
toilet. That's the one I always know about. I don't. Yeah, it's like transforming into inanimate objects or something. This is reading up on this just reminded me. Did you ever watch a TV show called Totally Spies?
no.
This will be relevant, I promise. It's just like a kid show, but I remember just looking back on it recently with a friend, and yeah, there's a lot of fetish stuff in that show. There's like transformation. There's like them getting gagged up and stuff. It's like it's very like almost quite overtly fetishistic when you watch it back. It's like, but of course, when you're a child, you don't realize this at all. And so yeah, if you didn't know about this stuff, but you watched that show, guess what? You were exposed to it all along, and you probably were exposed to it. You know, going back to what we said at the very beginning, you said that it happens. You have this sort of epiphany or whatever before you're 10. A lot of people point to so foot fetishes are very common, and a lot of people point to Cinderella, the scene where she puts on the glass slipper. A lot of people point to that as like their turning point. I think
Yeah.
you know what you grow up with, it has a very big impact on what you'll be into.
And it's important to kind of to it's important to be clear that this is a healthy thing. This is not,
Yeah.
if you notice that your child is maybe like suddenly really, really obsessed with this sort of unusual niche thing, that's totally fine. They're just exploring a part of a realm of themselves, and maybe that becomes a private aspect of their life. But I mean, why what's it, deprive them of having fun or an interest? It might stay, it might go, it might not. But if it forms a like a positive outlet, then it it's a good thing. Which kind of brings me on to the topic of kink shaming. So because there is a lot of stigma around kink still in society, and a lot of the original root is mainly due to religion. So a sexual activity is purely for sexual reproduction, and anything else, you are a deviant and doomed to hell.
Damn right, yeah.
Which is also where the rape fantasy comes, because women were not allowed to have sex before marriage. And so often the only way that they could conceive of having sex before marriage is to be raped.
That's mad. I didn't even think about it like that.
I mean, a friend discussed this theory to me, and I was like, that's actually a really interesting point. Like,
it makes sense, yeah.
A lot of these things come out of a form of religious purity, and but like it's fun to be naughty, you know. So
Absolutely.
does this person want to be raped? Probably not. But you know, it's about the idea of breaking rules and breaking boundaries is always seen as exciting and thrilling.
I think that go back to what you were saying earlier. Like, if your kid is showing this sort of interest in it, the worst thing you can possibly do, for multiple reasons, is to like shun them or tell them off or tell them that it's not okay. Religion is the best example, because yeah, like you say, it's from reading stuff and just from talking to people who were raised extremely religious, like not just normal, like you know, excessively religious.
Cult.
I would describe it as. They not necessarily a cult, but just like, you know, strict religious, basically.
Yeah.
When you're taught that sex has to be this one thing, you're almost guaranteeing that they're gonna twist it in their mind to something else, because like you say, they might say that it has no other option, or it's just in the human nature to want to break these rules and stuff, you know, and not go along with the norm. So it might even be that, like, you know, these things will pass if you just don't pay attention to them and just sort of, you know, don't think about them too much. But if you're telling your kid constantly, you can't do that, that's dirty, you have to, you know, be married, whatever, then they're almost more inclined to gravitate towards it, because that's human nature. It's and also that's not to mention all the, you know, psychological harm you're doing to them because they think they're a freak and they're weird for liking this stuff, and that obviously isn't great because it makes you feel like, you know, you're not a normal person, when really, as we mentioned earlier, there's billions of people probably that have fetishes and kinks.
No, it's believed that, well, what was it? Christian Joyce et al. Found that out of 1,500 participants of men and women in the US, 64.6% of women and 53.3% of men had sexual fantasies that involved kinks or fetishes. And this does, like, to be clear, kink doesn't always have to be like doesn't have to be hardcore fisting, gagging, being tied up with ropes. It could be something like having your hair pulled, or spanking, or like the batons, or kink start, or a threesome, kink, or anonymous, maybe going to have anonymous sex, or so it doesn't have to be you know,
these outlandish concepts,
outlandish,
like fucking a plane or something.
Within the gay community, the idea of breeding, that's quite a big kink within the gay community. These sort of things are like past, like, these things are not necessarily super hardcore sex. It's all about the escapism and the mentality. And then however, who engages in sex is less clearly known, and it's thought between 2 and 62% of people engage in it. But 62% of the population engage in sex, and that most people actually enjoy it. 39% of people who engage in kink really enjoy it, and only 1.3% of people who've engaged in kink really haven't, which kind of goes to show that it is, for most people on the whole, highly pleasurable, or it's more pleasurable than not. And between very much so and not, there is, you know, and how often people do it. It's, some people want to do it like maybe 13% of people want to do it all the time. 29% of people who want to do kink want to do it sometimes, which kind of shows that kink isn't all the time. It's not, you know, there's nothing wrong with having more traditional sex, but people like the possible escapism there. And you don't, like, it's important to kind of basically distinguish that you don't always have to have kinky sex, and it to be considered in it, to be considered to have a kink, and that also most people enjoy it. So you shouldn't shame kinks, because chances are you like it, and probably your mate likes it too, but you're not talking about it.
Yeah, you what was I gonna say? Oh, I've completely lost it now. But I was gonna say the whole I think society is on its way to sort of recognizing this sort of stuff as normal. But of course, it's taken us a long time. I remember when I was studying law, one of the first cases we did, it's very interesting for numerous reasons, but it's called Brown, Crown versus Brown, 1993, where these guys, all men, engaged in this BDSM sort of gay behavior. And you can imagine that 6 white old judges were a bit confused by this, And the whole argument, basically, the legal argument was essentially like, well, they're inflicting occasionally, very serious bodily harm to each other. But of course, they consented to it. And, there was a whole legal dispute, which I think if the case was today would probably be laughed out of court because, I mean, it's what people do in the privacy of their own homes and they're consented to it. There's absolutely no risk to public safety or anything. The main argument was, of course, that it was in the public interest somehow, which of course it isn't. So I think that we have sort of slowly started to wrap our heads around these things, probably with the help of the internet and social media. Like I mentioned, those websites, they expose me to it, so I'm not as weirded out by it as some people are. If it becomes mainstream, perhaps that will mean that the next generation will be more open-minded to it because they'll be, they'll come to understand it at an earlier age.
Yeah, if it's sort of something that's just sort of okay, then that's sort of fine. I mean, some realms of kink still are involved in the DSM-5. For those who don't know, the DSM-5 is basically like the book that doctors and health clinicians and psychologists use to basically diagnose people with disorders. And it's the two that are involved in it are sexual sadism and sexual masochism, when it causes significant clinical distress. So basically having this kink, or basically the social stigma of having this kink, causes worries about job loss and so on. So job loss and financial security, which sort of just goes to show that it's not actually, the person themselves is not distressed by actually having the kink. It is the societal pressure shaming the kink. And this is what homosexuality was originally perceived as. It was perceived as a disorder because it caused significant distress, not because the person themselves had an issue with being gay or a lesbian. It was because society had an issue with somebody being gay or a lesbian or bisexual, and that put a significant amount of stress on those individuals. So I think this is hopefully something the DSM will revise. But it is still seen as today an issue within the medical community, and hopefully this will progress. This sort of stems from the very birth of psychology, which will probably form out of religion as well. In 1886, this guy called Richard von Krafft-Ebing wrote a book called Psychopathia Sexualis, which basically opposed homosexuality and fetishism as a genetic degradation. So basically said, if you like kinks, you're stupid and you're a weak human, passing on this seed or weak in humanity, classic early eugenics and psychology. And Freud also could be could also be given a fair chunk of the weight of sexual oppression. His concepts of female hysteria, the Oedipus and Electra complexes, and also he described masochism as the most common and important of perversions. The most common and important of who is, I think, I can't read what I wrote, but he basically said it was wrong.
It's just all like old, and again, it's like you can't exactly blame them because imagine being back in the day where you just had no idea about any of this stuff, and then somebody says, "Oh yeah, I want to," they have all these fantasies and stuff. Just like, I think that's what societally we're slowly starting to understand it, just because we're more exposed to it, we're more aware of it. People can talk to each other a lot more freely. I mean, a few hundred years ago, it was unfathomable that you could be gay. We've come a long way, and I think we still will in the future. We'll eventually come to realize that this is normal, and that there's nothing to be ashamed of about it.
No, well, you could be gay they knew that, but that was bad. But the concept of being a lesbian, that didn't
Oh
exist.
yeah, yeah, it didn't even exist. Yeah.
Lesbians didn't exist until about 1920s. They realized that lesbians were a thing, but they didn't want to bring it up in case it encouraged women to become lesbians, so they didn't.
As if they would get the idea. It reminds me of this interview with I think it was the president of Zimbabwe or something, and he was talking about the lions that were spotted having gay sex, and he was like, "Oh, they probably got the idea from gay men." It's like, oh, okay, yeah, that's how it works. Oh dear.
So yeah, there is a weight of oppression on kink, and my friend who brought up the topic and said, "Well, should somebody say who's into leather, or say into who's into age play, or into maybe being like a dog or something, be able to do this in public?" And I would say, well, as long as it's not sexually explicit
Yeah.
to the point, like to the point where I don't think that that's a problem, because especially in like dog play, or dog play as an example, there's a distinguishment between those who engage in sexual play and those that don't. Those who engage in sexual play are called yiffies, and those aren't, are just called doggies, I think.
Yeah.
And it's that they just want, and so I think, and if you, and should you be able to just, I don't know, walk down the street wearing wearing your leathers and wear apart, because the only time I can really think of where I would be able to see this other than in a sexual environment would be Pride.
Yeah.
Which is again because kink is not pure, is not in a sexual identity, so it doesn't fall under the LGBT umbrella. That basically means that straight people can't express their kinks.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's like, again, it's like when you say you're straight, you have this weird image of, oh, you have to basically like missionary sex and whatever, you know. You can't have anything else. Yeah, it's just something that will come with time, I hope. It's like human understanding is cumulative. We'll eventually come to understand that this is normal, slowly but surely, and it'll just hopefully we'll just be able to deal with it.
Definitely. And if you are allowed to be open about your kink play, it might make it easier for you to find if you are monogamous, maybe your life partner who is interested in kink play, or maybe a partner. Because also, yeah, I mean, monogamy is not for everybody. As long as it's consensual, polyamory is totally cool.
Yeah. No, exactly.
Which I think is, yes, the foundation of kink. Kink is all about consent, which is just healthy, which is good, healthy sex. And so everyone should be encouraged to get in a way engage with kink, because it properly discusses how to explore yourself, how to explore that arena with somebody else or with multiple people.
Any sexual activity is about consent, ultimately.
Yeah.
So if you just have to be made aware, be very clear with your partner.
I mean, definitely. And sex, and that doesn't have to be verbal. You don't have to say yes or no. It could be, you could have a safe word, or you could have like maybe like a double tap or something else if you don't want to do certain things, or you're not into something, and that takes the pressure off you to basically have a long discussion about something you don't like, and uproot maybe something quite personal that you don't want to with a partner.
Yeah, you don't have to write a biography. It's just like, you know, as long as you're both on the same page, you know, you're both aware of what's going on. Because I think that's the biggest thing, the biggest misconstruct, you know, biggest thing people misconstrue about this stuff is that they almost think that you can like break the rules, I guess, you know, of normal sexual conduct. Specifically in like, you know, where there's a power play involved, or like where there's a rape fantasy or something like that. You know, again, the very important thing is that you need to be on the same page. It can't be a one-sided affair where you just, you know, start it and bring it up. Like A very simple example is like, it's pretty common knowledge that a lot of people like, choking is a big thing. A lot of
Yeah.
people like that, but that doesn't mean that you could just start doing it without any sort of indication that that's what they want. That would be ludicrous, because that does fall back into the realm of, actual GBH or ABH, like just actually doing it. They don't consent to it. Consent aspect makes it a kink, and therefore makes it sexual conduct.
And this, and also conversations about what your boundaries are and what they aren't don't have to be strictly, like a formal meeting. Yes, today we are going to discuss what I like. You can explore it through fantasy and play again. It doesn't have to be, because sex doesn't start when you literally engage with each other physically. Sex starts in your brain, and sex starts, say, through talking and through communicating and flirting. So you can introduce this much earlier on without necessarily having to, like sit down in a suit and, I don't know, a smart pair of
yeah. You don't have to like have this long-winded discussion. I would argue that if you're unsure, or if you want to be clear about something, then it's probably best to have like a proper discussion with the person, especially if it's something that's quite, unusual, I suppose. But otherwise, like, like say the choking thing, if you just like bring their hand to their neck, that's pretty strong indication of what they want.
Definitely. Also, like within degradation within sex, some words might be okay, some words might not be.
Yeah.
So say if you're, in this case, a woman, and you like being degraded in bed, you might like being called a slut or a whore, but you might not like being called bitch.
Yeah.
Like, and so so there's, and that could be, then that's the same for, say, somebody who's trans. They might call their body parts different things to what you expect them to, what you might perceive them to be. And for that, and that helps that person enjoy the experience. So it's important, but that can also just be part of a conversation, which leads to a more fulfilling experience.
Yeah, there's always going to be stuff that's off limits. Again, it's a fantasy. It's not like you want to be enjoying yourself. You don't want to be like reminded of shit you just want to, forget. It's supposed to be a playful experience.
Definitely. So if you want to engage in kink and you're not really sure where to go, I think it's sort of, well, first of all, from what I haven't really researched it too much, but if you're heterosexual, I know that you can, if you have a partner, you could be a swinger and go to swinging events, or you can go to sex parties. Those are another thing I've heard of. Within the gay community, there is lots and lots of opportunity to have casual sex or quite kinky sex if you want to. So if you're into very much anonymous sex, you can go to a glory hole for a start. And in London, I researched this on Yelp. In London, you can go to somewhere called the Crown, which is a pub which has drag acts, and then also a glory hole section. And then there's also a cafe called Fix 126. You can go have a coffee, and then in the loo there's a glory hole if you're interested.
Exactly. I would even go one step further back and say, if you're having these thoughts and feelings and you're not really sure what they mean, firstly, just Google it. It might sound stupid, but it's amazing. Like, you'd be surprised. Like, you might think you're the only person in the world that feels this way, and all it takes is a Google search to reveal this
Google it.
20,000 user forum about what you're into. It's like, oh, okay. 4chan especially, not that I want to recommend that website in general because it's a bit of a shit show, but they have boards for pretty much anything. So you'll find pretty much whatever you're into on there.
Maybe watching porn. I think it's actually quite a shame that Tumblr has stopped being able to show porn, because I know a lot of people, it was a great platform for basically amateurs to put stuff up, and expose you to a lot of different
Yeah.
kinks, because there's definitely a niche pocket on the internet.
I
But
say
I'm sure
DeviantArt and Newgrounds are the only two I can think of that will allow that stuff, and then that's where it's most common for that reason.
but and then I'm sure there's plenty of stuff on OnlyFans.
Yeah.
And if you just want to self-explore. And then also, yeah, in the gay world, there's saunas, there's some clubs with sex rooms. There's also cruising, which is when you say go to a park or an open space and basically see what's around and go for it.
Exactly.
But just yeah, make sure you're safe. And you know, if you are going to engage in something like that, make sure that you protect yourself in whether
Yes.
that be PrEP or whether that be a condom or whatever.
Be naughty, but be safe.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't really have anything else to add. But this was a really fun conversation, really fun
This
thing
was
to
great.
research.
I really am interested in this stuff. I just find it so fascinating on a psychological level. And you know, it's ultimately it's one of these things that we just have to really get the stick out of our asses about. It's like just accept the fact that people are into stuff. Again, I think ultimately it does come back to what I said earlier, where you'll just never understand on like a basic level the way they do, how they feel about stuff. So I can understand how you'd find it very unusual and hard to wrap your head around. But you know, ultimately it doesn't have any effect on your day-to-day life. So just let people do what they want, and they shouldn't have any worries about it.
No, let people be people. Because
Yeah.
you probably actually do something yourself, which is a bit like, which is rather odd. So you
Yeah,
know,
we probably my hope even is that when we said stuff like hair pulling and stuff like that, people would may not have even realized that that was like sort of a kink or whatever. But you know, ultimately
being
anything that's not one other person is pretty much a kink, you know, anything that doesn't fall into that very specific guideline. So, you know, uh don't just it's all good. Don't worry about it. It's all normal. You're normal.
yeah, yeah, I
Nice.
don't think so. Yeah, thank you, and I'm gonna say bye. So bye.
Thank you. Bye.